Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good evening. This is the first lecture of the season, so I'm thrilled to see all of you here. My name is Jasmine Raymond, and I'd like to welcome you to Dia Chelsea. It's our Artist on Artist lecture series program. I begin by thanking the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support of the series over the years. We've been running this series now for 12 years. Brooklyn Brewery for their complimentary beverages tonight, which I hope you're enjoying. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at DIA for their assistance coordinating this program. The Artist on Artist for 2014 is presented in honor of Frances Bowes through the generous support of Cindy and Howard Rachowski. Tonight's talk is the first, as I said, in the fall season, and will be followed by Sharon Lockhart's talk on Steve Paxton, who just had a series of performances at the Beacon last weekend in November, and then in December will be Sam Lewitt on Hannah Darboven. Please take one of these small brochures with you tonight when you leave so that you know when to come. And I'm delighted to welcome Erin Shirreff, who will be addressing Donald Judd's work as the starting point of her talk tonight. Many of you who have been to the series before know that this is a little bit of a trick. We invite an artist that we love and admire to talk about an artist from this program or exhibition collection, but it's really an excuse to hear them talk about their own practice, their own work, their own way of looking at art, their own thinking. So it's a Freudian kind of joke. We're thrilled that Erin accepted this invitation. As many of you know her work, I'll try to be brief here and just give a few remarks on her biography. She graduated with a BFA in 1998 from the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, and completed her MFA at Yale University in sculpture in 2005. She began exhibiting her work in New York in 2008, and in 2010 participated in the celebrated group exhibition Greater New York at PS1. Among her recent solo exhibitions are the shows at the ICA Philadelphia in 2010, the Shinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas in 2001, Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver in 2013. And last year, she was artist in residence at Art Pace in San Antonio and the recipient of the EMEA Photography Prize from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Erin is currently in the midst of preparing 2 major solo shows, so she's been quite busy. So look forward to seeing ICA Boston and the Kunsthalle Basel in Switzerland in 2015. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and please help me welcome Erin.
Thanks so much for coming tonight. And thanks to Yasmiel and to Kelly, who's not here, I think, for the invitation to take part in this series, to Megan and Francesca, Max, Patrick, all the people here at DIA who helped me in ways large and small to put all the pieces together. And I also wanted to thank the people that I spoke to on the phone or by email in the weeks leading up to this talk or months leading up to this talk. You've been really sort of generous, you've been really generous with your time and your expertise about all things Judd. And if you're here tonight, you know who you are. So thanks very much. Judd is one of those artists that people have thought really carefully about, and I've really benefited from your insights. It's also just been really sort of thrilling to immerse myself in a time period in New York City that is sort of everywhere around us still, but can really feel so gone. And it's been really sort of interesting to walk down those streets and look at the buildings and think of them in different ways. I'll just start by saying that I'm going to be showing images here in the center behind me, and the 2 videos playing on the left and right are a work of mine, which I'll talk about briefly at the end. Okay. Permanent installation. This is Donald Judd's idea that he arrives at in the second half of the 60s, permanently installing a work of art. He's responding to, at that point, sort of all of his disappointments in taking part in the exhibition circuit. Work is not shown proper respect, it's damaged, installed without thought to the artist's intentions, or by overreaching collectors. When it's put in group shows, contexts are created that lead to generalizations and misapprehensions of his work. He's after physical and conceptual preservation. This is a quote from an essay that he wrote in 1993. Any work of art, old or new, is harmed or helped by where it is placed. This can almost be considered objectively, that is, spatially. Further, any work of art is harmed or helped, almost always harmed, by the meaning of the situation in which it is placed. There is no neutral space, since space is made indifferently or intentionally, and since meaning is made ignorantly or knowledgeably. This is the beginning of my concern for the surroundings of my work. These are the simplest circumstances which all art must confront. So the idea comes from a growing understanding of his own work, what it needs, and he's realizing that precise installation can really articulate his work. Its integrity can be maintained if it's cited in the correct manner, and he's deciding that he's the best person for the job. And he's understanding this by living with his work and looking at it day after day, his work and the work of other artists. He says, without duration, perception is almost impossible. Judd developed and enacted these ideas first in New York City in a studio on 19th Street. This is a picture of that. Then at 101 Spring Street, which he bought in 1968, which is now just recently reopened. Then in a major way in the early 70s onward till his death in Marfa, Texas, at sites that Dia actually first funded, some of which eventually became the Chinati Foundation in 1986. This picture of Judd's studio on 19th Street is from 1964, and I was really struck when I saw it because it's so rare to see a picture of a messy Donald Judd studio. And I think, obviously because he sort of subcontracted out all the fabrication eventually, but I think it really gives a sense of how active he was in this time period and how he was moving through ideas so quickly. I really just like this picture. It's rare. When he moved down to Texas, the stakes were raised a bit. The works there would not just be in unity with site and space, but with the environment and with the landscape as well. They would be isolated, free from the aesthetic noise of the city, and the plan is that they would exist in quantity. Together, they would provide his work as well as the works of a few other artists. They would provide a critical portrait of the best art of the contemporary moment. As he said, and it's sort of famous at this point, just as the platinum iridium meter guarantees the tape measure, Chinati is a measure for the art of this time and place. He built it, as he said, in defense of his work. As Judd developed these installations at Chinati and elsewhere in Marfa, he was thinking about the present, the recent past, especially his own, but also the future. He wanted to install works in a way that had permanent validity. There are many aspects to Judd and his work that I feel personally close to and compelled by. The legibility of his forms and materials, his belief that the plain things can be the most complicated. We share an interest in a real sort of physically felt indifference. I admire how much he understood his work as he moved forward, his conviction that artists are primary. I'm just really into his general vehemence as a person. But it's this idea of the permanent installation that really hits the top of my list. And it's one that has left us with this living experiment in West Texas that sort of unfolds forward in time. Because, of course, time goes on, and the work is there as it was first installed. And while Marfa, the town, has been transformed in the intervening years, the landscape around Chinati remains much the same. The platinum iridium meter is no longer the standard measure, but it wasn't even when he initially wrote that. The materials in Judd's work, aluminum, plexiglass, auto enamel, that were once so novel and so non-art are now sort of commonplace. And the material options in sculpture have sort of exploded since then, which I think actually makes his work sort of seem, ironically, more specific, because these materials and colors sort of seem like a signature. Because at this point, as we all know, Judd is a big, heavy part of art history. And he's been yoked in this general way to the idea of minimalism, which at this point has become a style of objects and interiors and lifestyle, and that style is everywhere around us. So, an art critic recently said to me when I was talking to him about this talk, the problem with Judd is that we first liked him for what he wasn't, but now we like him for what he is. I was told also in preparing this talk that Steve Jobs sent his Apple campus design team to Chinati for a site visit, which is pretty interesting. Anyhow, all of these, this minimal style that we're sort of surrounded by now makes the spaces in Chinati even more of a time warp, because if you go there, it can still feel strangely really contemporary. But I would say even just more broadly, since Judd moved down to Texas in the 70s, it's my feeling, and it's shared by others, that there's been a real shift away from relying on our bodies to sense and interpret our surroundings. We are living much more in an image-centered culture, which is like a big generalization, but I'm gonna make it. And it seems like we are, sort of somehow less attuned to the bodily experience of looking at art. This is nothing against Gober, obviously. This is a picture that accompanied a recent review of Gober's show at MoMA. And it's just like, it's so, it's something that we see all the time when you go to museums, but I was like, wow. Anyhow, it speaks for itself. I read an article recently that called this shift excarnation, not image into flesh, but flesh into image. And certainly since the 70s, I think it's safe to say that our patience and our attention is sort of waning and has been fragmented day to day. This is a picture that I just came across online. I don't know the context of it, but it's pretty amazing. Anyhow. But apart from this sort of larger shifting context, I think it's still really unique to see a thing and know that it's been there for a really long time, and to know that the aim is that it's going to stay there for the foreseeable future. I mean, how does this affect the objects and us and our experience of them? And I'm not talking about sort of the nightmare conservation issues, which I'm sure are manifold, but in my experience, I find myself projecting or feeling different affects from these works, or an affect that would ordinarily be present is somehow emphasized by these circumstances. For instance, Judd's aluminum boxes at Chinati in the artillery sheds, they can feel to me at different times stoic, stubborn, vain, incredibly, incredibly still, burdensome, and even at times sort of poignant. I mean, when I see a Judd box in a gallery show, I don't necessarily think about my own mortality, but when I see one installed in the desert forever, it kind of occurs to me. I mean, there are other kinds of this, built permanence in life, protected architecture, et cetera, but I think that the installations down in Marfa really ask you to experience them anew each time you go. The visit or the experience isn't scripted, like it might feel, going to see a church or something like that. So in this way, in the stillness and in the permanence of these installations, each time I go, it sort of reminds me how much I've changed. I am not personally on Facebook, but I've been told that it's something that, now because you're in touch with that guy from 5th grade, and there's this thing called the feed. My husband's rolling his eyes in the audience, I'm sure. There's this thing, the feed, I guess, where you have like comments from people like, the 5th grade person, and then your spouse, and then your ex-boyfriend, and then whatever, it all kind of comes together. And you have to like sort of experience all your different past selves all at once. And the first time I went to Chinati was in 1998, which, wasn't that long ago, but, It was a long time ago. And I remember really vividly how indignant I felt as a recent undergraduate that this artist would have installed his artworks all across the desert. And, it's really uncanny to go through there now and to be literally walking, in my own footsteps through these spaces and to feel so radically differently about, what I'm looking at and experiencing. So I haven't put any pictures up of Chinati yet because something that I think is also a part of this permanent installation is, how does that place or those installations, live in our mind here now? I would say that we can kind of form an image of them sitting here right now, of those works down there, sitting there in the dark. And I feel like that's a very different experience than, trying to recall a show that you saw 3 months ago, a week ago, etc. I think what I'm trying to describe is that the permanent installation, for me, kind of creates this in and out of time quality. And this makes me think about photography. And I don't mean in a cliche way that Judd's spaces in Marfa are frozen or fixed like a picture, although in many ways they kind of are. If you study pictures of Judd's installations and then you go, it can be pretty uncanny. I mean, and in the reverse, if you've been there and then you see images from whatever time period, I find they sort of trigger this faint body memory. Here's one that does this for me, does that for me. This is by Todd Eberly of this area in Judd's residential compound, downtown Marfa, called The Block. And here are 2 photos of the same installation in Marfa, and the pictures are separated by a decade, almost a decade. But I'm thinking more of the physical affect of something being both very present, but somehow apart or foreign. Stand across Green Street today and look at Judd's building at 101 Spring Street. It's very physical, it's very there, but I had this strange experience just the other day when I went down and looked at it. It feels to me like you're looking at a 3D rendering more than a building somehow. It feels like an image. Photography, photographs are full of dualities and ambiguities. They are images and objects. They have this quality of both expressing a moment and then being carried forward in time. And this affect of photographs sort of reflects my own experience of living in the world, being in my body. I, of course, feel my age. I understand that it's a finite thing. But, of course, my experience of living is a succession of present moment after present moment after present moment. And this is why I don't consider myself a photographer, but photographs and images, I think this is why they're so primary to my own work. But it might be strange to think about photography and minimalism together, since the former is so tied to the ocular, the camera is the eye, and minimalism, we are told, is so much to do with the body and space. But in the early days, as we know, people said that photography was too literal a form to be able to produce the abstraction necessary for true art. And this charge is echoed in the early 60s by critics of the work being made by Judd and by others like him. Literalism. It's actually this quality that excites me most about photography because, while it describes so precisely, it also limits and curtails, it flattens. It's both very evident and it's also mysterious. These things, it's a dynamic that for me is also very present in Judd's objects, these things that are so plain and so clear, but also so complex and so other. Judd himself, as I was told again and again and again and again and again by people in his orbit, wasn't interested in photography. And when I asked Megan and Francesca's help here at DIA to help uncover any mentions of photography in his many writings, we were only able to unearth one. He just sort of includes it in passing along with a list of other art forms that have a tendency, in his opinion, to self-ghettoize and become complacent. There are like all of the art forms, actually. But this lack of material seems to sort of prove these assertions of his non-interest because, Judd wrote so many reviews and he was so engaged in looking and responding to the art of his time. And photography was there. He just doesn't seem like he was engaged with it, which, knowing what we know about Judd and his work and his interests, seems understandable. So these were somewhat surprising. These are pictures in the collection of the Met Museum that were taken by Donald Judd. They're very small. They're like 4 by 3.5 inches. And they were taken in the late 60s and early 70s when he and his family traveled to Baja and West Texas. This is before his big move to Marfa. There are 15 pictures in the Met's collection, and they have no titles, and there's a sort of descriptive text written on the back. And the dates are just estimates. And there are others like this in the Judd Foundation down in Marfa. I was told that Judd had a Hasselblad camera that he got through Larry Bell, and it's supposed that these were taken with that camera. These date from a time when he was first considering moving his studio outside of New York City, and he was considering Mexico as a possible location, which he eventually decided against because it was just going to be too impractical with the border and moving things back and forth. These to me look very informal, and they're sort of like note-taking, I think. I think it's safe to assume that he didn't consider this his work. They reflect his interests in, local architecture, local customs, traces of how the land was used, just his general interest in desert landscape. And these are all interests that he fleshed out later on in his installations in Texas. There's sort of interesting anomalies because, I don't know what happened. There we go. There are interesting anomalies because I was told, he didn't take any pictures later in his career. He never used a camera. Which isn't to say that he isn't pictured as a subject. There are a number of pictures of him in the studio or otherwise, and his personal spaces in New York City and Texas have all been extensively documented. His condition for the latter was that nothing be disturbed or arranged for the shoot. The photographer couldn't alter the space to make a better picture. Judd was, in that, I don't know what's happening. There we go. Judd was always prioritizing, even in that instruction, he's prioritizing 3 dimensions over 2 dimensions. This is the kitchen and, the spaces in 101 Spring Street. As it was explained to me, Judd's attitude was that this was documentation, not creating an image, which is what we would imagine Judd's attitude being, right? He's sort of invested in the documentation of his works, especially for a historically minded artist like Judd for posterity, but maybe uninvested in the end result as long as it described without editorializing the thing itself. The curator of his 1998 Whitney retrospective, Barbara Haskell, recalled Judd being, really invested in the accuracy of her text descriptions of materials and processes in her essay, but he wasn't present at all for installation photography of the show. Although she said, she would imagined reasonably that he would have objected to anything other than straight photography. And we're going to set aside the question of what, in fact, straight photography, which is the mode, of course, most often used in art documentation that has a faith in representation at its core, would mean for someone like Judd, because it seems like he set that question aside himself. Todd Eberly, who extensively photographed Judd's architecture and installations in the early 90s, and these are, we've seen some pictures of his before tonight, and these are 2 of his as well, recalled him issuing only very general and vague instruction: show the space, show the architecture. But I've kind of come to the conclusion after looking at this stuff and reading and talking to people that it's probably important not to speculate too much on Judd's role in these pictures, or even how his role may have evolved, because the photographic record we now have of his work is forever going to be, in real terms, very murky. So much of that, photographer-artist negotiation is informal and unrecorded. And at this point, many of the photographers he worked with have died, or just too much time has passed. This is a picture taken in 1972 by Paul Katz of 101 Spring Street. It's a gorgeous picture, and it's taken in a manner that turns the building into this very Juddian object. And I was told, and it would seem that Judd had a hand in orchestrating this picture. But when I spoke with Paul about it, he said he didn't remember ever speaking to Judd about it, ever. So, the photo record for Judd includes images taken by galleries, by collecting institutions, and all of these people have their own motives and needs. The photos are often uncredited, and they're almost always undated. Judd's works were sometimes remade at a later date and then rephotographed, but the object bears the date of the original. So there's just a lot of general unevenness in his photographic record. And of course, he's eventually working at a level that control of all images and all publications probably would have been unfeasible. He was just, he's a busy guy. But what I think we can say is that, at least early on, Judd wasn't as interested in the potential of imaging his work as some of his peers were, like Smithson or Morris or later Serra. And the history of sculptors really using photography is long. It goes back to photography's inception and includes artists like Rodin, who really exploited it as an artistic and social tool, and then others who were maybe a bit more suspicious of photography but used it nonetheless. Alex Potts, who many of you have probably read his stuff, really interesting, has written really interesting stuff about minimalism and its photographic record, speaks about Judd's documentation as essentially unsuccessful, mostly because it fails to convey the nuanced impression of the object that Judd was after. It's just too difficult to translate. But he also calls them unphotogenic. Other artists like Robert Morris, distrustful as they may have been about photography, or distrustful as they may be about photography, to Potts, successfully used it to dramatize the effects of their work. And here's a picture of Morris's 64 Green Gallery show that Potts is really positive about. The problem in this comparison is that Judd wasn't after drama with his work. His works are often assertively undramatic, which is its own brand of drama, to be sure, but maybe one better to be sensed than pictured. But here's a picture of primary structures here. Has Judd and Morris side by side, and you can maybe see what Potts is referring to. As Yasmiel mentioned, I grew up in British Columbia, and there are no Judds in BC, at least not that I ran into. So I first came to know his work through pictures and through general sort of interpretive texts about art from the 60s. And a confession, I too was pretty underwhelmed by these pictures. And I think, if I'm honest, I probably carried that skepticism with me, when I first saw the works in person. On some level, they probably colored both my first and my second impression of the work. Which is to say that when I finally saw Judd, I didn't really know what I was looking at, and I didn't really know how to look at it. And I think that experience that I had is probably pretty common. Of course, now that I'm much older and wiser, and especially after I tasked myself with really specifically looking at his pictures of his work, his documentation has started to register a bit differently. And what I've come to appreciate is that regardless of his role or his intentions or even his disregard, the kind of work that Judd was making, his particular take on what we now lump together as minimalism, I think can align really well with the limits and possibilities of photography. It's not always the case, but I think it can be. One of Judd's biggest critics, Michael Fried, complained that minimalist work distances the beholder, not just physically, but psychically. It's something that you hear very often from friend and foe alike, and about Judd in particular. This this quality, physical and psychic distance, is also inherent to photography, especially photography of objects. So it's actually Fried's criticism that, to me, sort of describes how well-suited Judd's work can be to this form of circulation, especially now when I think as a culture we are so skilled at looking at images, and the normalization of image culture is such that the apartness of what's being depicted is sometimes not quite as felt. Right out of the gate, I want to say that I'm not talking about the photograph replacing the work. Judd's work is with us in the dimensional world. To experience the work, you need to be present with it, walk around it, for it to impress upon you. Richard Schiff calls a Judd encounter thinking and feeling at the same time, which I really like. Elsewhere, I've read it called a tactile visual sensation. Judd wanted to make physical things that mattered to look at, but that set in motion this other experience unified with it that is sort of hard to articulate in words, and other than to say that it's not mystical and it takes time. So there isn't just a loss in a photograph of Judd's work. It's not just incomplete. In 2 dimensions, it's inchoate. But despite this, and I said before, as I said before, our images are what we often have at hand when what we have at hand when we're learning about an artist, and there are just so many of Judd's work. You can just Google him. And if art history is the history of images, as has been said before, it seems interesting to look at how Judd's aspirations for his works translate in reproduction. And, not the aspirations of Judd the minimalist, but Judd the artist. One of my favorite Judd quotes is from a piece called Local History in 1964, and it's a complaint, of course, about the drive toward neatness in art history. He says, "The history of art and art's condition at any time are pretty messy. They should stay that way. One can think about them as much as one likes, but they won't become neater. Neatness isn't even a very good reason for thinking about them. A lot of things just can't be connected. Things can only be diverse and should be diverse. Styles, schools, common goals, and long-term stability are not credible ideas." And yet, at this point, Judd's work and Morris's work and Andre are commonly grouped together, of course not here at DIA, but and a shorthand exists for what they achieved by both proponents and critics of their work. And I just bring this up here because I want to suggest that the most useful way to appraise photos of Judd's work is not to think about them in terms of minimalism, but to really think about what Judd wanted to do. In that essay from 1993 that I read from earlier, he describes his 3 modes of working. 1, work that was placed on a flat surface with no intention of space other than that implied by the work. These are his specific objects. 2, work that articulates part of a room or some of the outdoors. And 3, work that is the whole room or an area outdoors. Judd's development was really fast, and he moved back and forth between these modes continually, so those aren't to be thought of in chronologically. So anyway, I thought we could look at some pictures of each mode. Some documentation is definitely shaky, especially in moments when he's trying something new, sort of like in transitional moments. It's like the images don't know what they're looking at, like the camera doesn't know what it's looking at, the images don't really know what to do. But some, I think, get it right, or as right as they can. And I focused on early era sort of classic photos, because they were what was circulating when Judd was developing his work. So these are all going to be from books. And, I'd apologize for the quality of the images if that wasn't part of the deal. So just as a little preamble, art history says the minimalist object is in the space with us, and our interactions with it are central to its meaning. Furthermore, with no internal articulations, the viewer's attention is forced to the sight. But for Judd's first mode, his specific objects, these were objects that were meant to be looked at, and looked at carefully. James Mayer wrote this wonderful piece called The Minimalist Unconscious. It's an article, and he writes about how composed Judd's works are, despite his disavowal of things like composition. Further, the space that Judd was interested in was the space implied by the work. Judd wanted to articulate space, but not necessarily for you. And when you see one of these works made in this mode, you naturally want to walk around it. But Roberta Smith, in her essay for Judd's 75 Catalogue Raisonné, an exhibition catalog for his National Gallery in Canada exhibition, writes about the possibility of locating a point from which the entire structure is understandable. So it sort of begs the question, could we not just set up the camera in that one perfect spot? Judd wanted in these works to transmit a sense of wholeness, a singularity that was grasped through very careful, focused looking at the object itself. And in pictures, from time to time, the focus he was after is sometimes conveyed, I think, pretty goofily. Here is, this is some seamless backdrop. I don't know if you can tell under that sculpture. Stuff that you would never do now. Seamless backdrop under that sculpture. And, of course, on the other side, this object's been completely silhouetted on the page. And this is, in my opinion, the pièce de résistance. This is from Judd's 68 Whitney catalog. And I mean, it feels like a Donald Judd graphic design decision, but I have no proof. Potts complained about the downward angle, of much of Judd's documentation. And, it is awkward, I think. It's an attempt to isolate the object, to cut off any surrounding information, but it seems to also sort of index a head peering downward or alternately upward. Here in the bottom, you can kind of see the underside of this work. But, in either case, the object's geometry is sort of distorted, and the rhythm of the piece's internal order is, set off and messed with. Here's a typically bad picture of a progression. This is a form of work for Judd that I think is never pictured well. I've looked at a lot of pictures. But to my mind, the best pictures of this mode are works that sort of dispense with a bodily point of view, and they show the objects at their own best angles. The lines are straight, the angle is clear. These are the perfect spots in which the objects are discernible, complete, apart, autonomous, and there to be studied in all their detail. Most of the early pictures of Judd's work were printed in black and white. And of course, later on with the addition of color, it really goes a long way in terms of conveying the specificity of his materials and color palette. These are the same, this is the same object, and this is the same object. Just as a sidebar here, I was looking at a lot of these pictures, and these two, or ones like them, these are the ones that I started to like the most. And I'm not sure that Judd would agree, but who knows? I like them because they're so disorienting. You don't really know what you're looking at. They're very precise. They have all those qualities of the earlier ones that I think are successful, but they're very sort of strange spatially and materially. I have no idea what kind of carpeted enclosure this thing is installed in. And they make you, because of those things, that they make you look longer at them than you would, with typical documentation. So in a way, it's sort of creating the encounter that I think he wanted in space, but here in picture form. Of course, sometimes the photo fails in every respect. Here is Roberta Smith's description of this particular work, again in the catalog from 1975. This is one of those moments when Judd's work is evolving and the photo doesn't have a chance. Ironically, it is when his work is starting to get reduced further and becoming more singular. I'll read her description. A copper box, 3 feet high, 5 feet square, is open from the top to the aluminum bottom. The bottom is light cadmium red. You cannot see the red until you look into the piece, but it is implied in this particular instance by the copper. The color seems to rise, and as you look inside, you see this reflected expansiveness first, before the actual color. The spread of color into the metal is an illusion, but its effect is real and traceable. She goes on to say, instead of moving around the piece in order to locate a point from which its structure is comprehensible, it is necessary to move toward it. As Judd's forms open up and or repeat and become frames for space, both inside and out, this is the second mode he's listing, the emphasis in the, to my mind, successful images becomes, rightly, the space that they create, sometimes to the expense of the structures themselves. Pictures of this mode of work are, in general, more reliable. The POV, the point of view, is generally from a position standing on the ground with the work, and you kind of feel that, like you're on the ground with the work. The space is typically empty and open, ready for you to project yourself into and experience the work for yourself. The surrounding space is included, and sometimes it's even emphasized. At times, pictures of these works are, the works are only captured in part. They run right off the edge of the images. Maybe because the space was too shallow or the work was too large to be able to picture it without involving, the distorted lens of a wide-angle lens. But regardless, the effect is that the space takes center stage. Some of these are really dynamic structures with much to feel bodily in space. There's more than one perfect spot from which to look at it. Between the light and the shadows and the angles, I feel like, many of these images are doing their part to convey this. There is now the visual drama that Potts was looking for. And at times there isn't. This is the only view that I've ever seen of this work. It's the same picture, color, black and white. And it's a large piece. You guys probably know this work. I didn't know. I had never seen it. It's large pieces of galvanized steel that are bordering a room on 3 sides. It seems like an unusual work for Judd. I mean, of course, you can see it's a Judd, but I think you can say that it just really dies on the page. So when Judd starts considering not just the entire room, but the surrounding landscapes in his installations, which is the third mode, this is when his work and photography stop flirting and they just get straight married. And I think it happens, really fast, because photography is made to show space. These images I'm going to show you are all from this really beautiful, modestly sized 1987 book that he made to announce the establishment of the Chinati Foundation. And he lays out a sequence of similarly formatted, exactly formatted images. They're all black and white, showing buildings, exteriors and interiors, and installed works, his and others, both inside and out. As I said, they're primarily black and white, which seems like a money issue because the whole book has sort of this fundraising, annual report vibe to it. And the images are typically sort of direct and to the point. They are, for the most part, either straight views, 45-degree angles, overviews, or this picture is so cool, a detail, which is really rare. Like the ordering systems that are embedded in his objects, this pattern of views in this book is it's of note, but it is, as ever, in service to the work. And in this case, the work is the objects, the architecture, the landscape in which they're situated, and here for the first time, I'd say it's also the pictures. There feels to me, despite their factualness and their sort of harshness, it somehow seems that they have this sort of palpable feeling of ease or equanimity in them. It just feels like everything loosened up somehow in this, informal desert sort of environment. It's very, 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 very difficult to take an unbeautiful picture in Chinati, but and I think another talk could probably delve into the conventions that he's alluding to, and I'm thinking specifically of the pictures of those concrete works out in the landscape. But for my purposes, I'll just say that I feel like this collection of images is the first, it represents the first time that Judd's role in documentation isn't murky. He didn't take these photographs, but his imprint is on them. just like everything at Chinati, and it's sort of deeply felt, I think. When I was in grad school, I'll show you two more. These are details of the artillery shed works. When I was in grad school, a classmate said to me, we were talking about being nervous showing our work, and she said, oh, she doesn't get nervous because she knew she would never get a unanimous vote. And she said, the real challenge is just to find your audience, which is something that has really stayed with me. And it sort of seems to me a thing that's remarkable at Judd, because he was so clear from the get-go that in this case, his audience wasn't sitting on the other side of a lens. He really didn't try to make his work in photographs initially. Of course, he sort of agreed to the conventions of documentation, but I don't think it was until later that it seemed like he really could see what could happen in the frame. And it wasn't until everything within the frame was his. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about the videos that are playing left and right. This is a piece that I started when I was an artist in residence at Chinati. They're still not quite done. The loops right now are an hour, and they're going to be a lot longer. And I'll close just by saying a little bit about them. The structures that are pictured in the videos are prototypes for Judd's concrete buildings. He had made plans for an arrangement of 10 buildings, here you can see in his drawing, 3 variations of this form on the Chinati grounds that would house progressions, stacks, and floor works. There's plans, I think, to realize these plans in Chinati. Who knows when we're going to be able to see that happen, but it's very ambitious. It would be really beautiful. I've been told that these are actually the only existing designed and built architectural spaces by Judd. He renovated existing structures. But he died before these plans were realized. And these prototypes, they're actually not even they weren't planned to be the actual buildings either. They're just prototypes because I don't know if you can tell, but and for those of you who haven't seen these in person, they're slabs of cement that are incredibly thin, and it's just rebar going through them, and there's no internal pillars or anything. They're just sitting on each other. It's just this very sort of like shell-like structure. They're quite striking. Anyhow, they're now sort of in this strange limbo. They're just sort of halted. They're between being half built and half falling apart. These videos are composed of many, many, many still images that I took on site. I set up my camera between them and then just turned it to look at this one because they're facing each other in the landscape. Turn them so you guys are sitting where I was taking pictures. And then I took some of those pictures and I rephotographed them in my studio. And there's also very brief moments of actual live video recording. You can see the grass is moving. It's pretty subtle. Maybe you saw that. The transitions are meant to be seamless until they're not. Sometimes they're really obvious. The videos are very, very handmade, and they're very analog. There's no digital effects in them. And I think you sense that when you see them. But, like Judd's work, these videos are, for me, are and are not about what's being, what you're looking at. Carl Andre has said that sculpture for him is about, this is this great thing, coming right up to the edge of an object and having to confront the gulf between you and it. The disaster when you see there is the self and all that is not the self. And it's funny, that's at the root of my interest in sculpture and in objects myself, but the way I found myself dealing with it is by one remove, by using images of objects. And I'm not sure if that's because I'm living now and my sense of the physical world and my sense of touch is, so different. And, I don't mean to make too much about it, but I do think things have changed since back then. But one of my interests in images of objects, and in this case, making a really, really long duration of a lot of them, is that they freeze that separation Andre is talking about, and they allow you to sit with it and to regard it. They draw out that moment of apartness. Images, looking at images is so familiar. It's sort of this unthinking transaction. But randomly, from time to time in these videos, all of the images can kind of merge into a continuum and create a feeling of presence. And that divide, the sense of the picture plane, at least for me, in these videos, falls away, and you're brought back in touch, not with the thing itself, but with a physical, a real felt sense of your separation from it, from its apartness and its unknowability. I don't know if it's ironic in the context of this talk that for me, I try to create this effect through a deluge of images, but maybe not, because I actually think of these works in sort of sculptural terms. Here, they're not shown like this. I've only actually shown them in progress once. This is a picture at Art Pace in San Antonio. They don't have a beginning or end. They're installed dimensionally in space. So I do think of them sort of, as physical things. So I will say, that I relate to the loss inherent in these images that we've looked at tonight of Judd's work. I'm asked from time to time if my work like this is, about authorship or about appropriation. And I think it's sometimes because the videos are really rarely seen in person. These things sort of circulate, if they do, mostly as video stills online or whatever. And, in those moments, it really feels like what's being pictured is the subject of the work. The picture betrays the work. And, it's a quandary that, this translation that always happens. It's so basic. It happens all the time. And it's one that I think about a lot. And for the last several years, I've been thinking about a lot in my studio. Thanks. We don't have to do a Q&A if there's no questions. I'd be happy to be done. Thanks so much for coming, you guys. I hope that made sense. No questions? Good.
There's a question.
Oh, Josiah.
No, you don't.
No, good. Yeah.
I was just thinking when you were talking about this, about Babette Mangold and her relationship to dance and the way in which, or Charles Atlas in terms of... Oh, I was just thinking when you were talking about this last part of Babette Mangold and her relationship to documenting dance, where those documents become something maybe more than what we think of as a document, or Charles Atlas in terms of his work with Cunningham and other people. Can you talk about, do you see that as being part of this question you have around Judd, like whether there could be some more acknowledgement of viewpoint as a kind of creative act in relationship to these works?
Oh, are we talking about Judd, or are we talking about my work?
Yeah, or either.
I mean, yeah, of course, there's the potential for sure. I sometimes think, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, like what Judd would think about all of this if he were alive, if he would be really invested in these questions, if he would look back on his pictures and wonder about these things. Because I think, the pictures of his work that are being produced now look so different than the pictures that were produced back then. I guess that's what I would sort of wonder about that. And I've thought about, my guess, who knows, is that he would be really sort of indifferent to all of these questions. But yeah, I mean, it's hard. In my own work, I try to sidestep any sort of subject matter like that, sort of like this is about that question that's really sort of explicit, and just sort of really try to create an encounter. I realized in researching this talk how Judd-like I am in my own practice, which is really weird. I feel very old-fashioned when I was reading some of these old texts, because the things that he was trying to do are things that I really want to do too. And the terms that he was interested in are very familiar to me in my own studio. I don't think I'm answering your question, but do you have some thoughts about it? Because I always like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I was just thinking about Potts, which I think for me is perhaps the most interesting writer that I've read on sculpture, and the way sculpture is a performance, or the experience of sculpture is a performance, or sculpture relates to performativity, and when I was really struck by when you were talking about loss, so this feeling of what is missing from the photograph, and with the exception of Todd Eberly, we're not talking about the names of any of these photographers, and neither are we talking about a kind of explicit point of view, except when you so rightly noted that there's certain photographs that do seem to actually approach an ideal way to photograph it in a way that creates an encounter. And I guess to my mind, it just suggests the extension of this question into an intelligence approach that would be subjective, but would be a personally enacted attempts to spread the physical performative as opposed to the imagistic sense of sculpture.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, what would that look like?
I don't know.
I guess maybe I kind of shrug my shoulders and I just sort of say there's a loss, that things aren't really carried forward. There is the experience that things just can't be conveyed in certain formats. I mean, that's my feeling generally. It's so goofy, I find, when people are trying to do like video document, whatever, or something, not that that's what you have in mind, but yeah, I don't. How's that? Thanks again, you guys.